and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. I am delighted to welcome Marc Fasteau and Ian Fletcher as our esteemed guests on today's podcast episode. Let me take a moment to introduce our guest. Marc is the Vice Chair of the Coalition for a Prosperous America and a partner at Sereno Properties, which develops and manages high-design luxury hotels, including Le Sereno in St. Barths, an upcoming project on Lake Como, Italy. A former managing director at Dillon Read Company, Marc also led a Rockefeller Foundation-backed commission on US policy toward South Africa. Earlier, he served on the several key US congressional staffs. He holds degrees from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, where he graduated magna cum laude and was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. Our second guest on today's episode is Ian Fletcher. Ian serves on the advisory board of the Coalition for a Prosperous America, a 2.7 million member organization focused on reforming US trade and industrial policies. He is the author and co-author of several influential books on trade, including Free Trade Doesn't Work. With a background as a senior economist, research fellow, and IT consultant, Ian holds degrees from Columbia University and University of Chicago. In this episode, Marc and Ian will share key insights from their latest publication, Industrial Policy for the United States, Winning the Competition for Good Jobs and High-Value Industries. So without further delay, let's welcome Marc and Ian to the podcast. Marc and Ian, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Very glad to be with you.
Yeah. So my first question to Marc and Ian, both of you, what motivated you to write this book? And why do you believe now is a critical moment for the United States to rethink its approach to industrial policy?
Well, I'll take a whack at it. We both have our different paths, although they've actually crossed. I got interested first in trade policy back about 22 years ago. A lot of industrial jobs and businesses were leaving the country after China was admitted to the WTO. And so I started lobbying on trade policy. I did a lot of reading, decided I thought free trade theory didn't really hold up. And so I was very naive. I'd go to Washington and start lobbying on my own, and people would say, what's wrong with you? You don't understand comparative advantage, or who's paying you, to do this. But eventually I found a staffer at one of the senator's office who said, well, if you're interested in this, you should read this book by Ian Fletcher called Free Trade Doesn't Work. I read it and I thought, man, I wish I had written that book. I really liked it. And so we got together, and then we're both now associated with, as you said, with the Coalition for Prosperous America. And about 8.5 years ago, we were talking, and I said, well, somebody should write a book about industrial policy, because trade is just a part of a coherent industrial policy. And he agreed, and we said, well, you should write it. And I said, well, you should write it. So we decided we'd write it together. But my motivation was twofold. It was clear that we were headed in a bad direction, that the economics under the dominant paradigm of free trade and the extreme free market approach, that our blue collar workers had been having a very hard time for a very long time, going back pretty much to the 1970s, which matters a lot. And it also, my fear was, when the economics go bad for a lot of people, a significant percentage of people in a country, the politics follow. They get worse. They get more contentious and more extreme in both directions, and so on. So that's what led me to this.
Ian, your take, please.
Well, I wrote this book which came out in 2010, way before free trade was open to question in the eyes of most of the experts. I wrote this book because I originally went looking for it on Amazon.com, the booksellers, and I couldn't find any such book. So I concluded that in order to read the book, I would have to write it myself. So since then, I have been working with Marc. And one of the things you learn when you work out the economics that tells you why free trade is not your best move as a country. And I want to make clear from the outset that neither of us are against trade per se. It's just that we favor strategic rather than unconditional integration with the rest of the world economy. And we favor that for all countries, though, of course, we're Americans, and our concern is with the United States. But anyway, when you figure out the economics that tells you that this is the correct position, one of the things you learn is that industrial policy, which is the application of policy tools to the domestic economy to improve its ability to generate wealth, which comes down to having the best industries, having the best, most advantageous economic activities, that industrial policy, far from being a dead end, which is what you're generally taught in the US, that industrial policy, it's largely something nobody's even heard of in America. And if they've heard of it at all, it's this strange European thing. It's this quasi-socialist idea, maybe as something vaguely connected with other forms of authoritarianism and general government meddling in the economy. And that's very much against the opinion of both most of the American population and the educated specialists in economics. Is just not something you ought to do. But I had this intriguing result that there was a very strong economic indication in principle that this could be a winning move. And then you look at countries quintessentially in East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, China, that were quite openly engaging in very, very big time aggressive industrial policies. And their economies were not just succeeding, they were doing really well. So you put those two together and you start wondering whether or what an industrial policy for the United States would look like. And it was a tough book to write because there's almost nobody in the US knows very much about the topic. Certainly nobody in the economics departments. You have some people in, East Asian studies and so forth. But it took us 8 years because we had to go back to fundamental principles and then figure out what this would look like, how this worked generally, and then what this would look like for the US. But anyway, this book, which is quite a big book, is the result. And we're proud of it. We think it's readable. We people seem to find it interesting. So this is where we're staking our claim right now.
Mark, you argue that laissez-faire ideas like free trade and floating dollar have failed the US economy. Can you unpack how these policies have contributed to the loss of good jobs and high-value industries?
Yes. Well, first of all, there's nothing inherently wrong with, as Ian said, trading most of the time. And there's nothing wrong with having the dollar float as long as there are the various factors that influence how it floats and keeps it from actually floating freely are dealt with. So, first of all, on trade, the free trade theory ignores so many different qualifications, so many different factors that that make it not work very well. The main thing is that that the theory says if you leave it to the market, right, which is it's the same idea, free market, free trade, leave it to the market to decide which industries you're going to have in your country, you don't necessarily do as well if you decide which industries are, in our book, we call them advantageous. They pay well, they lead to the next big thing, they're high value, and they have long futures. If you're not in them or you don't have an entree into them, and just leave it to free trade, you will never get into them if you don't make a specialized effort that takes government intervention to force your way into them by spending a lot of money, protecting when you start up, protecting them as infant industries, which of course goes back to Hamilton and a lot earlier, in fact, back to the 16th century Britain, and that you focus considerable resources on developing them. The United States used to Shanghai people who knew how to build weaving machines in the day when that was high technology, and so on. So the free market attitude of the U.S., both domestically and on not intervening in trade, ignored all that. And beyond that, there is no free trade. Right? The U.S. and the U.K. and maybe New Zealand and Australia, I'm not so sure, are the only countries that have believed in it and who have more or less, not completely, abided by the WTO rules. Every other country in the world does not believe in free trade and never has. So they basically agree to certain legalistic constraints in order to get guaranteed access to the U.S. market, legally guaranteed with a free trade treaty. And then they proceed to basically evade, ignore, et cetera, work around the agreements. For example, it's no longer really about tariffs. It's really about non-tariff trade barriers. And the Commerce, I guess it's Commerce or USTR, trade representative, lists about 1,000 of them. You can get a big list. I think they mutate. If we bar one of them, somebody else. So there's always a finger, on the balance. So other countries protect their markets. For key industries, they do distinguish. Anybody with an industrial policy says, yeah, we don't care about this. You can send in as many socks and, dolls as you want. But, don't mess with X, Y, and Z industry. So if you don't have an industrial policy, including a trade policy and a policy which supports research into these key industries, and you don't get your currency right, you don't have an overvalued currency, your industrial policy is the industrial policy that your trading partners have and impose on you. It's not like if you don't do anything, it's neutral. If you don't do anything, you're playing their game. And that's true if you just leave everything to the market, even if there were no trade. If you left everything to the market and the government didn't support research into new long lead time breakthrough technologies, you would never have them because those take so long to develop and they're so risky that the private sector won't take on these early stages of them. So you think about the role of government, and everything in the iPhone has basically come out of government-supported research. But you want the government to get in and support them to the point where the risk profile and the time horizon for commercialization is something the private sector is willing to take on. That's when you want them to be turned over.
Yeah. My question to Ian. Industrial policy is often misunderstood in American political discourse. How do you define it, and what are the most common misconceptions you aim to correct in this book?
Well, you can start with the idea that America doesn't do industrial policy. The fact is, as we discovered researching our book, America does a lot of industrial policy and always has. We just call it something else because we have an ideological squeamishness about the concept. So, for example, the internet, where did that come from? Well, the internet was not invented by some entrepreneur in a garage in Palo Alto to make money. It was invented by government scientists with government money to share data largely in relation to military projects. So that's how you get this incredible enabling technology. and jet passenger planes. Or let's look at that quintessentially American construct, Disney World. Why do we have Disney World, where you can fly people from all over the country to go on holiday in Central Florida? Well, you have that because you have rapid, cheap transportation by way of wide-body airliners. Why do you have wide-body airliners? You have wide-body airliners because you have high-bypass turbofans, which are the only kind of jet engines that are big enough and efficient enough to get good gas mileage for an aircraft that size. Well, the entire jet engine industry, and in fact, the very idea of a giant aluminum aircraft, the first of which was the B-29 built to bomb Japan in the Second World War, this all came out of the military. The civilian aircraft builders at that time knew that such a thing might be possible, but from their point of view, it was billions and billions of dollars, a very risky investment that might pay off decades in the future. And of course, it might turn out to be a dud. I mean, remember the Concorde? That was a dud. There's all sorts of technologies that are duds. So where has America been willing to plunk down the money, not just for science, but for developing the actual technology, and for not just developing the technology, but for standing up production lines and supply lines and an entire industrial base to produce the thing? Well, it was largely because of the Cold War. Now, there's a second part to that. The other thing that the government has been willing historically to spend money on is public health. A long time ago, when in my previous career I was an IT consultant, I had as a client American Home Products in northern New Jersey. So I go out there on the first day, get a tour of their campus, which they give to new employees and people coming to work for them. And the guy giving a tour told us two things, which are stuck in my mind. The first is a medicine is a small dose of a poison, which is not the relevant one here. The relevant one is nobody does real research anymore. We all just have spies at the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health, which is a government agency that spends tens of billions of dollars a year developing pharmaceuticals, which then the drug companies figure out how to produce and test and market and so forth. So you have governments being very willing to do industrial policy with a vast range of tools to protect us from scary communist foreigners, scary diseases. And the new thing with Joe Biden is climactic disasters, because Joe Biden added to the national security and public health justification for industrial policy, he adds environmental protection. So you have hundreds of billions of dollars in the Inflation Reduction Act for basically electric cars and other forms of green energy and the infrastructure that goes with that. So we think that's all great. We think that it proves that industrial policy is not un-American. We think it proves that industrial policy is not beyond the capabilities of the US government. But it also raises the question, if we're willing to do this for these three reasons, national defense, public health, and environmental protection, why aren't we willing to do this for the sake of prosperity? Why aren't we, for example, willing to put that much money into civilian robotics, which are clearly a very important technology for the future competitiveness of American manufacturing? And it's a technology where America grossly lags, despite doing the most important theoretical research in the field. Why don't we just say, we have to do this for the sake of our prosperity, and do that, and not just in robotics, but in a whole host of industries?
Yeah, can I just add a gloss onto that? I think what you're hearing, if you listen to the different parts of industrial policy that we've spoken about, is that they all fit together. I mean, we talked a little bit about protectionism, strategic protectionism. We haven't yet talked about the currency. We will, I'm sure, at some point. If you don't get that right, you're giving a big advantage to your trade competitors. And then we've talked about supporting not just pure research, but research to the point of commercialization of the new product. Um, the thing is, a part of the price we have paid as a country for not thinking about industrial policy per se is that we don't think systematically about it. We don't sort of say, okay, here are the three pillars. How do you coordinate? How do they work together? For example, today, the Trump administration, kind of very, clumsily at the beginning, is they got the tariff idea, and it looks like they're working toward more selective tariffs aimed at the right industries and at the big what they call reciprocal tariffs, which have been tried historically in the U.S. a couple of times, and they don't work, and they don't work for a lot of reasons today. Um, are going to go down, and they're going to working their way toward a policy that looks like it's going to make sense. And they've even in their president's first memo on trade policy talked about getting the currency right. But at the same time, they've been taking a meat axe to the third pillar, cutting funds for NIH, cutting grants to big research universities, mostly for medical stuff, and even cutting funding for some military labs, within the Defense Department, of which there are many. We in our book, Industrial Policy for the U.S., we list every government lab that exists. There are lots of them within the military and so on. So that's why it's important to think about it as industrial policy, not just trade over here and currency over there. Because who knows how does currency affect the bottom line is our question. So I think that's the overall message is the three pillars. You have to think about them coherently to get the maximum benefit.
Yeah, and one of your core argument is that government should support the commercialization, not just the invention or new technologies. Can you elaborate on why this distinction is so important?
Sure. Well, I mean, NIH is a perfect example. If you look at the mRNA vaccines, saved millions of lives, looked like they were developed at incredible speed. Well, the final steps were really accelerated greatly. And the government took a lot of the risk for one of the big companies, but the research tail goes back about 15 years through NIH and other university grants where nobody knew how to make a nickel out of it. Big pharma wasn't going to take it on, and so that's a lot of money and it's a lot of time. So if we hadn't had government in there, we wouldn't have had those vaccines, and many more millions of people would have died. That's one, I think, a very vivid example.
Yeah, Ian.
Well, if you're looking for other examples of the commercialization pipeline, the important thing to understand is that the myth in this country is that government does pure science and private industry does the rest. In point of fact, when you're looking at the many, many stages that go between a scientific discovery and a product you can sell to a customer at a profit, there are many stages that cannot be monetized, where you're researching something that you cannot directly sell. Frequently, you can't even protect it with a patent. The technology is too generic. It's too close to a law of nature. You're ruling out a dead end, which once you've done it, everybody else benefits from your research that you paid for and they didn't. Or the timelines are just too long to be within the reach of a private sector company. There are a very limited number of companies in this company that have a time horizon beyond a couple of years. And historically, if you look at those who do, for example, the legendary Bell Labs of the old American Telephone and Telegraph Corporation that existed from 1916 to 1985 and gave the US the world's best phone system, the lowest rates, and everything. Bell Labs was responsible they practically invented the 21st century. They invented lasers, they invented transistors, they invented, all sorts of stuff you wouldn't even think of, like sound synchronized movies, hearing aids, radio astronomy. Just on their day off, they invent all this stuff on the way to creating this great phone system. The reason they were able to do this is they were a government-sanctioned monopoly. So they have a very artificial circumstance, which is really a kind of indirect government subsidy for research. Because Uncle Sam says to them, okay, basically what you're allowed to do is you're allowed to overcharge people for long-distance phone service to do two things. One, you subsidize local phone service so everybody can call 911 and get the police. And number two, you spend billions and billions of dollars a year on scientific and technological research that's not going to pay off until who knows when. They were inventing lasers before anybody knew what a laser was, what you could do with it. But because they have a government-backed monopoly, which is really an indirect government subsidy, they can do all these amazing things. Now, a government-sanctioned monopoly is just one way that government can artificially support this long-term technological research. I previously mentioned paying for the military contractors to do it, and there are lots of other ways. But the point is, you need public support for the development of technology, not just science. You've got to get away from this myth that all valuable technologies are created by private entrepreneurs on a for-profit basis, because they just aren't.
Here's the way to think about it. Everybody knows what a venture capital fund is, or at least all of your listeners do. So, and of course, they're private businesses, so they have the same limitations on risk and how long they're allowed to keep the capital before they have to return it, and have an event that returns capital and hopefully a profit. Well, think of the United States as a big, huge venture capital fund. Well, it can take a lot of risk because it's got more income than anybody else in the world, and that means it can make a number of very expensive bets, and if spread it around. And secondly, it's in theory, its time horizon is forever. It's not going away. So it makes sense in that sense, even from a business sense, for the government to do these kinds of things. That doesn't realizes some of the benefit and sends more tax revenue if you create new businesses, but it also gets all the social and economic benefits that accrue to its population, which you could think of them as as the investors in this fund. That's actually not a bad way to think about it. So therefore, you want the government to take these long-term, high-risk, potentially huge value chances, fund these things. And if only they probably have a higher failure rate than private venture capital funds, because they're all risky projects. But two or three of them hit, and you've changed the country, you've changed the economy, and the IT is an enabling technique for technology for almost everything that we do. It keeps spreading. We're still seeing the benefits of it. Just GPS, that's now feeding into almost every industry. Mobile phones. The mobile phones would never have happened without that. How has that changed life for the better? And on and on and on, to say nothing of the drugs and so on.
What lessons can the United States learn from the industrial policy success and failure of other nations like Japan, South Korea, or China?
Well, one lesson is it's a long-term business. One of the failures is the UK, unfortunately, and they failed in a lot of ways. But a constant is, switching gears. It's on, it's off. It's on, it's off. We're going to do this. No, we're going to do that. And every time the political party in power changed, the policies would change. Now, most of them weren't very good because they thought labor thought, okay, we'll nationalize the businesses and that'll automatically fix it. Well, it doesn't automatically fix it. You got to do all these other things. And when the conservatives took over, they thought, okay, we'll sell it back to the private sector and that'll make it work. Well, you're just changing owners. If you don't change what they do, you don't get any results. And if you had any policies and you're in and out. So that's one thing. So all these Asian countries were very consistent. They picked their industries. It's not that hard to decide which industries are important. What's a little harder is to decide how to sequence them, especially if you're trying to catch up, which both Japan and South Korea have done what we call catch-up industrial policy. Now they're at the technological frontier, and and Korea's actually very much at the farthermost frontier in chip making. They're doing 2 and 3 nanometer chips. So consistency, and then you have to, as Ian always likes to say, no single industrial policy tool is likely to be successful on its own. You need a variety of them, and which ones you use has to suit both the particular industry, the country's culture, what they can accept, what they can't, the international competitive environment, who you're competing against, at what level, and you have to have trade policies which are also attuned to the particular industries you're trying to develop. And sometimes we have a list in our industrial policy in the United States of about 20 different industrial policy tools. It's worth taking a look at, but you'll definitely need more than 2 or 3, and you probably won't want all 20 on any one project. But it also, you have to be flexible as an industry develops internally. It needs less direct government intervention and more sort of policy standards, so on and so on. And Korea's changed. All these countries that have caught up are now using somewhat a suite of industrial policy tools that are tuned to where it is internationally.
Yeah, Ian, you discuss tools such as tariff, exchange rate management, and federal investment. Which of these tools do you believe should be prioritized, and how should they be balanced?
Okay. I'm glad you asked. Right now, the US has, under President Trump and then under Biden and then under Trump again, started to embrace a pretty serious tariff policy. It's no secret that what we have right now is a rather rough cut version of the very sophisticated and complex policy we're going to need for an advanced economy. But we are finally moving in the right direction. And I think we'll probably, not for certain, we'll probably get there. What the US has not yet done is something about the overvalued dollar, because we estimate at Coalition for Prosperous America that the US dollar is overvalued by probably about 17%. So if you have a 17% overvalued dollar and you have a 20% tariff on the European Union, then almost all of your tariff is wiped out by the overvaluation of your own currency. So you're imposing a tariff and you think, wow, we've got 20%. No, you don't. You got 3%. Furthermore, tariffs don't have any direct effect on your exports, but overvalued currency does, because it means that American products are too expensive overseas. So you now have, thanks to this overvalued currency, a big pressure on your imports and a pressure on your exports. And that's what the US needs to start getting serious about. And the way you do that, Mark will be happy to tell you about.
Okay, you have to do 2 things, because the overvaluation of the dollar is caused by 2 different factors. One, everybody's a little bit familiar about, which is currency manipulation by trade counterparties. That means when, say, Japan or China exports a lot of goods to the US, they get US dollars in return, and the government, um, instead of allowing the private exporters to take their dollars, the Chinese, or in this case, Japanese exporters, take their dollars and get their local currency by selling the dollars on the foreign exchange market, the government gives them their local currency, and instead of, in return for their dollars, and instead of putting those dollars back onto the market, they basically sequester them. They use them to directly buy mostly financial securities, a lot of treasuries, but also US stocks and bonds. The net effect is to keep those dollars off the foreign exchange market. So instead of a flood of dollars coming on, more supply means the price drops. That artificially supports the dollar. The other factor, which has actually been more powerful for a number of years now, is that there is a very large net inflow of capital into the US every year in the trillions of dollars. Why? Not government involvement. It's for the private sector. The US capital markets are the biggest, they're the most liquid. The rule of law is very strong. You can get a court judgment without waiting 10 years, as you do in some places, maybe India. And the returns have been pretty good for a long time. So a lot more people want to buy US securities than Americans want to buy other countries' securities. So you have a big demand for dollars, big net demand for dollars, which also pushes up the value of the dollar. So you have two solutions. For the first one, the currency manipulation, let's say Japan is manipulating its trade, forcing keeping the yen down and preventing the dollar from going up. Well, you do countervailing currency intervention, which means our Treasury Department goes into the foreign exchange markets and buys up a whole bunch of yen, creating more demand for the yen and pushing its value up. Sounds expensive? Well, probably takes a lot of dollars to do that, but you end up with yen, which is basically equal value. So it's not a net expense. And you can do it at scale. After a few vigorous responses to manipulation, you probably get, dial it back. The other thing, the private inflow of investment capital, is basically you have to make it less attractive to foreign investors. And there are a number of ways to do it. There's one in particular that our organization has been involved in vetting and developing, which is what we call the market access charge. And that is basically a tax. You could call it a tariff if you want to, but I think that gets confusing, on every foreign purchase of a U.S. security. So let's say you wanted to buy a T-bill or you wanted to buy a share of Microsoft, you would pay a tax which the Federal Reserve could move up and down as needed. And let's say the tax were 3%. That would make your net return on this financial instrument lower because you have to pay the tax. And that basically that tax or charge would be adjusted gradually so you wouldn't panic the markets to a level which brought the exchange rate, US dollar, down to the level which roughly balanced overall trade. It's never going to be exact, but instead of a big, huge trade deficit, you'd get it down a little bit higher, a little bit, little slight deficit, slight surplus. And that is embedded in that idea is the concept, the answer to the question, well, what is the appropriate exchange rate? What should the target exchange rate be for our country? Well, the only metric that links to economic reality and makes any sense is it should be at the level that roughly balances trade. I mean, that's what the markets are supposed to do. The free market theory is that will happen. For these two reasons, it doesn't happen. So these are remedies to get back to where we're supposed to be.
Mark and Ian, my last question. What are the first 3 steps you recommend the US Department to take to begin implementing systematic industrial policy?
Ian, you want to
Well,
start on that?
sure. As we've said, the big thing is tariffs, followed by currency reform, followed by governmental support for technology development. Beyond that, in the longer term, you're going to want to have some way of coordinating all these choices, which are going to be implemented by many, many government agencies across the economy. We don't advocate in our book the creation of some vast new government bureaucracy to implement this. We think that both for reasons of operational practicality and political necessity, the US should be working through its existing institutions. But you do need some decision making, some thinking capacity at the executive level. So we do think that there should be some more institutions within the executive office of the presidency to think about what industrial policies the United States should have.
We also think that one of the things, for example, we've talked about, you have the National Security Council and National Economic Council, that there should be an Industrial Policy Council in the office of the presidency, and that it, and therefore all the different agencies that have to be coordinated, should be charged with producing an indicative overall industrial policy every, 4 or 5 years. And they say indicative because what we're trying to get away from, as Ian mentioned, is some kind of a czar, which is going to make these direct decisions. But indicative, it would give guidance to all the different agencies, let them see how these things are supposed to coordinate, and give guidance both to the Congress as well as these different agencies as to, well, here's the task, here's how we're going to try to go forward with it. This is not involving legislative proposals, but what could it and what should it look like? We think that would help a lot.
Thank you, Mark and Ian, for joining us on today's episode and for sharing such thoughtful insights from your timely and impactful book, Industrial Policy for the United States. Your perspectives on rethinking America's economic strategy, challenging long-term assumptions about free trade, and offering a pragmatic, bipartisan roadmap for industrial renewal is not only refreshing, but urgently needed in today's rapidly evolving global landscape. Thank you once again, Mark and Ian, for sharing your valuable insights with us on Business Talk.
Thank you.
You're very
Very good to
welcome.
meet you.
Thank you, Ian.